Hello, I am 8mm Mauser Man. Except for today's video, I should probably call myself 5.56mm Nato Man, because today I'm talking about the difference between Winchester White Box, 223 Remington, M193, and M855. A few things before we get in though. One, I was going to do this video as an introduction to my 5.56 series. However, the same time I was kind of planning to do that, True Velocity 5.56 came out and threw that off a little bit, so I ended up uploading that video a couple weeks ago, and I'm doing this one now as the introduction, even though it's a little bit late. Number two, we need to understand some quick differences here between terms. You might hear terms 223 Remington, 5.56 NATO, and M193 and M855 a lot in this video. So we need to talk about those. One, SS109 and M855, as far as I can tell, are the exact same loading, just M855 is the American term, and that's what I'm going to use more in this video. Number two, 223 and 5.56 are both calibers, or they're cartridges. Because of that, you can find 223 that comes in a variety of different loadings. You can have 223 55-gram projectiles that will vary widely in their velocities. And you can find 5.56 NATO cartridges that have a number of variances and differences. However, both M193 and M855 are specifications. What it means is that since they are specifications, they should all be loaded about the same. All M193 should be a rough match. All M855 should be a rough match. Remember that as we are talking about this. These should fall into roughly the same specs with others, although if you did this same video with a different brand, you might get different results for the M193 and the M855. They should be pretty much the same. However, the 223 Remington could vary widely based on which brand you're choosing. A few questions I had going into this video. One, if I see Winchester White Box 223 Remington on sale, will it have similar velocities, similar accuracy? Basically, will it be usable for training even if I choose to opt for M193 for my more serious ammo use? Two, when M855 moves from a 55-gram projectile to a 62-gram projectile, how much velocity does it lose? I was just curious about some of these things, so that's the backbone for this video. Alright, getting into it, we should start with just a really quick history of the events leading up to the adoptions of these cartridges and how they kind of got their start. Early development of the 223 and 5.56 cartridges began in 1957, along with the rifle that would eventually fire it, which wasn't this rifle, but was one a lot like it. This is an relatively early M16 styled rifle. So the testers found that in order for a 223 caliber projectile to have the desired terminal effect, it would need to be fired at roughly 3,300 feet per second. So by increasing the case capacity of 222 Remington, 223 Remington was born. In 1963, a version of 223 Remington was formally adopted by the United States militaries as 5.56 NATO M193. M193 is a 55-grain projectile with a copper jacket and a lead core, firing at roughly 3,250 feet per second out of a 20-inch barrel that it was originally adopted for. Then, in 1962, I guess that was a little bit earlier, 223 Remington was also submitted to SAMI as an official cartridge. And in 1963, Remington's first, I think the first, if I am correct, 223 commercial rifle was put out on the market. You had the formal adoption of the cartridge 5.56, and you had the official beginning of 223 on the commercial market. We aren't getting into this in this video as it's not the topic, but we should just say 223 Remington and 5.56 are virtually identical. If you look at two of them next to each other, you won't be able to notice any differences, but they do have some dimensional differences, and general doctrine is that you should not fire 5.56 into 223, but it's safe to fire both 223 and 5.56 in a 5.56. Difference is 223 wild. We're not going to go into all of that in this video because it's not really the topic, and people disagree so widely on it. In fact, the rundown that I just gave, I know I'm already going to get hate comments for. Okay, so with those things adopted, in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, NATO was also looking at adopting a 5.56 cartridge, but they adopted a different specific loading. They adopted the SS109, which I believe was made by the Belgians. SS109 is a 62-grain projectile, and it has a steel penetrator inside that is like a steel that is stronger than like a mild steel often used in, you know, steel-cased ammo just for cost savings, but it's also not quite as hard to be armor piercing. So it's not necessarily an armor penetrative round, but it will help with barrier penetration or penetrating light armored targets. So that steel tip also helps with balance, and that makes sure that the tip of the bullet hits the surface you're aiming at and it's not wobbling too much in air, throwing off the balance like that. This means that it has better longer range performance, especially in the area of penetration, with a trade-off of lower muzzle velocity and worse terminal performance on soft targets. In the US, the bullet tip is painted green, and SS-109 is called M855. So those are the calibers and cartridges that we are talking about today. With that out of the way, let's talk about the specifications of these specific ammos. I only pulled one round apart. I would have liked to do more, but I didn't want to buy extra boxes just for this test, because again, it's not really the topic of today's video. However, the 223 Remington had a bullet weight of 55.2 grains and a powder weight of 26.6 grains. The M193 had a bullet weight of 54.5 grains and a powder weight of 27.2 grains. Both of those are supposed to be 55 grains, so the minor difference isn't really something that should throw you off. That's probably just normal variations in cartridges. And then the M855 cartridge had a bullet weight of 62.6 grains, variation cartridges, and a powder weight of 27.2 grains. So the M193 and the M855, they both had the exact same powder weight, just the different bullet weights. However, the M193 had 0.6 grains more than the 223. 223 tends to be a slightly lower velocity, so we would expect a little bit less powder, but I didn't pull enough bullets to get a full sample size and see the averages of these numbers. Looking at the components, all of the cases look exactly the same, but there are two distinct differences between the 223 and the 2556 cases. The M193 and the M855 are both exactly the same. However, the 223-1 has a slightly shorter neck. It's almost imperceptible, but you can see it there. And then 2, the 223 says Lake City, or LC for Lake City, and then 223 Remington. The 556 has the LC for Lake City, then says 22, probably for 2022, the year of manufacture, and then has that little circle with the cross inside of its symbol on there. All of the cases are annealed, which means the top half of the case is heated to make it easier to reload. It basically just makes the brass a little bit softer. And then, looking at the 3 bullets, the 2 55-gram projectiles, the 223 is up top and the 556 is on the bottom. The 223, as you can see, the sealing part around right there, the crease there, is a little bit further up than on the 556. So if you see a loaded 223 versus 556 cartridge, you'll notice that the 556, the bullet tip sticks out just a little bit more. Other than that, though, these bullets do look to be the about exact same. They don't appear to be any longer or shorter between the two. It's just that one difference. Then if I pick up the M855 here, the M855 is noticeably longer than the other two. It's also a pointed boat tail projectile. And the tip is painted green, which is what we do in the US to distinguish M193 versus M855. Because if they're both sitting in the case, they do look about the exact same. They sit the exact same part out, but both are really common in the US, so M855 has a painted green tip. Also, I didn't notice this on the M193, but the M855 definitely has a sealant there that is between the case and the bullet, and that's just to stop moisture from getting in. 556 and 223 are very velocity driven, especially in their terminal performance. I mean, all bullets are, but 556 and 223 especially. So let's talk about our velocities. I'll show you the video here. All right, let's shoot the M193. 3,258 feet per second. 3,255 feet per second. 3,231 feet per second. 3,263 feet per second. 3,248 feet per second. All right, next let's test the M855 out of a 20-inch M16. 3,121 feet per second. 3,157 feet per second. 3,146 feet per second. 3,133 feet per second. 3,086 feet per second. Okay, finally we have 5 shots of the Winchester 223 out of the 20-inch barrel. $3,231. $3,235. $3,221. $3,183. $3,208. Okay, next we have the M193 with the 16-inch barrel. $3,041. $3,138. $3,061. $3,024. $3,143. Okay, next we have the M855 out of the 16-inch barrel. $2,984. $2,987. $1,739. We're going to throw that number out. $2,979. $3,001. And finally, we have the 223 out of a 16-inch barrel. $3,042. $2,987. $2,983. $2,985. $2,997. All right. With the 20-inch barrel, our average velocity with the 223 Remington was 3,216 feet per second, and with the M193 was 3,251 feet per second. That's about 35 feet per second more than the 223, which honestly is not as much as I was going to expect with these guns, given how much people talk about the differences between M193 and standard 55 grain 223. With the M855, the average was 3,129 feet per second. So this was about 100 feet per second less than the other two. In fact, about 120 feet per second less than the M193. As far as energy goes, our energy foot-pound measurements with the 223 was 1,263 energy foot-pounds. With the M193, 1,290 energy foot-pounds, about 30 more. And with the M855, 1,348 foot-pounds. So we had 60 more foot-pounds of energy in the M855 than the M193. However, foot-pounds and energy is not necessarily everything, because M855 tends to stick together a little bit better because of that steel core. So it doesn't have as much tumbling, doesn't have as much fragmentation, and fragmentation is where M193 really gets its capability as a defensive or military cartridge. But I do still think it is interesting that the M855 does have a noticeably higher energy. Okay, then we can talk about the 16-inch barrel, which I tested with this rifle right here. With the 16-inch barrels, our 223 Remington in the average of 2,999 feet per second, Our M193 had an average velocity of 3,081 feet per second, and our M855 had an average velocity of 2,988 feet per second. So, one thing I noticed is that with the shorter barrel, the M193 had an 82 feet per second higher velocity than the 223, and that starts to get a little bit more significant. That is definitely more noticeable than the 30-something that was in the past. And the M855 had a slightly lower velocity than the 223, but honestly, those two are now really close. For our energy, the 223 Remington had an energy of 1,098 energy foot-pounds, the M193 was 1,159 energy foot-pounds, and the M855 was 1,229 energy foot-pounds. So we have about 60 more foot-pounds of energy with the M193 than the 223. That is, again, pretty significant. But terminal effect doesn't matter if you can't hit anything. So let's talk about the accuracy between these cartridges. Loaded up, I have 9 rounds of Winchester White Box M193. Alright, so next I have the M855. Next up we have 9 rounds of 223. Okay, so here we have our M193, and it's actually a pretty tight group, probably about 3 inches from this one to this one. This one's a little bit of a flyer, so if you don't count it, then it's probably about 2 or 2.5. I'll get exact measurements and put those on the screen. But that's our M193. This is our M855, and it's probably about the same size. Also a little bit off to the left, so maybe I just need to re-zero this scope bit. It's about 2.5 inches from furthest to farthest, and yeah, all those are about the same. There's not really any flyers. Now the 223. The 223, this was the last group I shot. Out of all of these, the sun is right up there, right in front of the target. I forgot to bring sunglasses today. This might be really bad because of me, but I still wanted to show you the results. We have about a 4-inch group from furthest point to furthest point, both horizontal and vertical. My eyes were getting tired, so that might have just been me, but it is definitely more off to the left. This could be because 223 isn't quite as accurate. It's just not made to the same specification as the 5.56, but it could also just be me. So that's what we got. Also, this is a 5.56 barrel, and sometimes 223 can struggle with accuracy a bit in a 5.56 barrel that's not like a 223 or 223 Wild. I took the target home and measured our groups. With the 223, out of all 9 shots, it was 3.92 inches, and then the best 7 out of 9, 3.17 inches. With the M193, the 9 out of 9 was 2.83 inches, and with the best 7, it was 1.9 inches. And then with the M855, it was 2.55 inches for all 9 shots, and 1.53 inches for just the best 7 out of the 9. Our best accuracy was with the M855 ammo, which I was honestly a little bit shocked by. Generally what I've heard, and this was maybe FUD lore, I have no idea, but I've heard that M855 tends to be a little bit less accurate because that steel core is harder to get center, so it can just cause some accuracy problems. Not that it's an inaccurate cartridge, but just that it's less accurate than the others. And I got almost a 1.5-inch group, 7-shot group with this gun that's not a target gun, with not the best scope, and that was just really interesting to me. This was especially interesting because this gun has a 1-in-9 twist barrel, which is obviously a little bit slower than the 1-in-7 that the M16A2 had, but this gun still seems to have no problem shooting the M855, in fact, shooting it better than the others. I just thought that was really interesting. We should talk really briefly about barrel twist rates. Originally, the M16 had a 1-in-14 twist barrel. However, it had trouble stabilizing some of the cartridges sometimes, so they moved it down to a 1-in-12 twist barrel, which the M16A1 had. However, this one has a 1-in-9 twist barrel, as does this gun here. Barrel twist rates are one of those things that people do talk about a lot. I don't think it tends to matter as much as people say it does, unless you're trying to shoot some wildcat cartridges, basically anything below 50 grains and above, I guess, 69 grains. And if you're trying to shoot those, great, pay attention to your barrel twist rates. But for people who are just sticking to 55 grain and 62 grain, something that is 1-in-9, 1-in-7, 1-in-8, it doesn't matter quite as much. Okay, so let's talk about my thoughts on 223, M193, and M855. One question I had was, is Winchester White Box 223 going to have enough velocity that it's still going to feel like I'm shooting M193? Because if M193 is my duty ammo, I want to be prepared for that, and I don't want to have all of this 223 that I am shooting and it's lower recoiling, and that might just cause some issues in training. In my experience, the 223 recoiled just as much as the M193. The velocities were lower, but still pretty close. I don't think you're going to notice much of a difference. Also, even though in my experience, it wasn't quite as accurate, I did mention it was the last group I shot that day. My eye was getting tired. The sun was behind the target. But even if that was an accurate result, that about 3 or 4 inch group, it still wasn't so bad that it's not good enough for training, especially if you're at closer targets. Okay, one other thing we need to mention. There is better 5.56 and 223 Remington cartridges. If you are looking for a home defense cartridge, there are varmint cartridges. There are like the 77 grain open tip match projectiles that those do expand, if I remember correctly, and they fragment in a lower velocity. However, if you are, like me, balling on a budget, M193 is, I think, not the best option, but it is pretty good. It's definitely something worth stockpiling because it has that higher velocity. Something else I'd like to notice, if you're going to be using these cartridges for personal defense, personally, I would stay away from 223 and I would go specifically to actual M193 projectiles, or M193 cartridges. The reason for that is because this ammunition is highly velocity based. And most people who are using an AR for some sort of defensive use are using a 16-inch barrel. With that 16-inch barrel, you're already sacrificing velocity, and that velocity will cause issues with that fragmentation, especially the longer you get out. So if you have even just a little bit more velocity for buying an ammo that's just a touch more expensive, possibly for M193, I would say it's worth it. Especially as you get into your more budget tier 223 ammos, those might have an even lower velocity so that they can spend less on powder, so that they can have less recoil into the shooter's shoulder. So make sure that if you are going to try and use 223 or 5.56 for a defensive use, you know what the specification is of the ammo that you are shooting. For training, use whatever you need for the needs you have. If you're just shooting at paper targets at 10 yards, it probably doesn't really matter that much, even if it is a lower velocity 223. But if you are using it for defensive use, or maybe other things like that, or you're using a rifle like this one, this scope has a BDC inside of it, that scope is probably for M193 and not 223, so I should use the M193 there if I'm trying to shoot out at farther away targets, so that BDC is still pretty accurate. All of that is to say, I think that's everything that I needed to talk about. I'm 8mm Mauser Man, and I shot Winchester White Box 223, M193, and M855, but I lived on.
Which proves it's hard to get the best of a man named John.
Big John. Big John.